This episode of The Candid Frame is sponsored by the Charlot Book Club. Working with the most respected names in contemporary photography, Charlot selects and delivers essential photo books to a worldwide community of collectors. Each month, members receive a signed first edition monograph and an exclusive print to add to their collections. Join the club by visiting charlotbookclub.com and use the promo code TheCandidFrame at checkout and receive a 10% discount on your first membership payment. There are times when the career of a photojournalist becomes encapsulated in a single iconic image, whether of a tragic political moment or a joyful triumph in sports. As important as these photographs can be, the measure of any great photographer actually comes from the legacy of stories they've told and continue to tell. It's the storytelling of today's guest, Vanessa Charlot, that I really appreciate. Whether she's telling stories of Haiti or the Mississippi Delta, she brings a perspective that is as rich with complexity as any of her photographs. Her mixed Caribbean heritage, her time as a veteran, and a working mother have all helped her to develop a compassionate eye that she brings to her work and that makes what she does both exceptional and intriguing. This is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame. I'm glad to have a chance to sit down and talk with you.
Likewise.
As much as I loved hanging out in Billings, it's just like I didn't have enough time with anybody.
I know. It was
It went by real quick.
Yeah, it did. The Curator Society did a beautiful job on pulling it together. So It was nice.
There are a lot of fires to put out, but I think they did a damn good job.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So I look forward to going there next year. So
yeah, for sure.
All they have to do is give me the date.
Same.
So I loved, learning more about you and your work while I was up there. Yeah, you've led a fascinating life and career. But let's start with you coming up in Miami.
Okay.
Because I know that's really critical to your beginnings, especially your first forays as a photographer. But tell me about your Miami coming up, because when most people think about Miami, they usually think about the beaches and the parties.
Right, South Beach.
And if they go back enough, Miami Vice and all that stuff. But, you came from a very, very different Miami than what most people outside of the city are familiar with. Tell me about what that was like for you. What was the community like for you coming up?
Yeah, so I would say that I came up in the real Miami, right? So I grew up in this amazing enclave of Haitians and Cubans and Dominicans that shared space, raised their families, loved and lived. It was extremely vibrant. The streets had its own soundtrack. So at any moment, you can hear merengue, bachata, compa, or reggae music happening all on the same street. It was a lot of fun. Yet at the same time, Miami was difficult, right? A lot of people were trying to find their way. As I said, it was an immigrant community. So people worked really, really hard to make ends meet so that they can raise their families. And in my case, I was raised by this amazing mother who, when I picked up the camera, I was 12 years old, and she was actually putting herself through nursing school at the time. And I was growing up in a community that my mother did not really want me to go to the local the local middle school. And so she happened to hear that they were accepting students at an art school about an hour away from my home, in a very affluent part of Miami. And she went out and bought me a Walgreens camera, one of the disposable ones. And she was just like, well, here's a camera, go take pictures in the community. And mind you, since I literally grew up in the hands of the abuelitas that's at the bodegas, the
Hmm.
taxi cab drivers, the guys on the corner. They've known me since I was very, very young. I was able to capture these, at the time, very amateur pictures of my Miami and present them to the school. And I really didn't know how to put a portfolio together. So I went with the envelope, and I showed them the pictures, and they loved the pictures. And so that's how I got into the school, and I began to study photography. And that's what really was a turning point for me on this lifelong journey to photography, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't say there's anyone else that I can say whose career of photography started through a Walgreens. You can own that.
Yeah, I mean, you got to keep it interesting, right? But
But when
yeah,
I
no,
first,
it was completely happen chance, right?
yeah. But, that reaction to your photographs really struck me. The idea that these pictures, as amateurish as they might have been, were revealing something that the person who looked at them was completely oblivious to, right? And the
Yeah,
idea
yeah,
of that the images that people of color create within their communities are sometimes the only outlet through which that world can be seen, especially from a more intimate, point of view.
yeah,
So that's, even though that's just your beginning story, I think that's a narrative that I think, you know, continues
absolutely,
as you've
absolutely.
matured and as you've grown as a photographer. It's like sort of kind of dealing with the same stuff as you were when you're dealing with at 12.
No, yeah, and it's very true. I am still very drawn to the aesthetics of people of color, particularly Black bodies. I think that we're beautiful. I love seeing how Black bodies take up space in a photograph and disrupt this idea of photography being meant for just one specific community. And if
Mm-hmm.
a community of color is photographed, I really love the fact that my work comes from a personal place. It's quite intimate. It's not voyeuristic, and that the photographs that I make and that I show are photographs of a life that I am currently living, right? So I still go to the bodegas. I still hang out with the guys on the corner. I still I still ride in the back of the taxi cabs for the poppies, right? Like if Lyft is not doing its thing, I know who to call to make sure that I can get to where I need to get to. That is still
Mm-hmm.
a very intimate part of my life, and that continues in my work.
You said an interesting thing, and I've heard you say it before about how you like how the black body occupies the photographic space.
Yeah.
Talk to me more about that. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you think about photographs of Black bodies, especially like within the historical context, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was usually a Black person in the corner or standing behind a white person or in a position of subjugation, too. So, even physically, how they were presented in the photograph was diminished. Their importance, their who they were as a person was denigrated in a photograph. And so, what I like to do is I like to put Black bodies in the center, or completely take up the frame, because I want for the audience to become curious as to who this person was and place them in a position where they can't look away, right? Like this
Yeah.
person has dominated the frame. And it really forces people to think about various narratives. Who is telling the story? Why isn't this story included? And how can I see myself reflected in the story of this individual?
Yeah, I think about that image that you shot in Mississippi of that. I think it was a farmer who had lost his
A
couple
sharecropper, a former
sharecropper.
sharecropper. Uh
Okay,
huh.
yeah, I think that image really speaks to that idea. Because you go back, like the images that were made, during the 30s and the 40s that may have included Black people, that even probably some of the more iconic images, you feel like they're, they're Black people. Can you see them? But you don't necessarily identify them as an individual. It seems like
Right.
you're seeing them more as sort of an archetype,
Yes. Yes.
as a more representative.
Yes.
And then when I see those images that you did in Mississippi, is I kept going, okay, this is a man, this is
Hmm.
a woman. These are individuals.
Right.
And what are the choices that you think you make as a photographer that allows you to succeed in being able to do that? What do you think it is?
Thinking about what you were just saying about the photographs of the past of Black people, think about like the projects done during, I believe, the FDA
Yeah. Farm
or the
Security Administration.
farmers, right?
Farm Security Administration. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the FSA, excuse me. There were some photographs that were taken besides the migrant mother of
hmm
Black families, and you see them off in the distance, right? Or you see them like it's as if the photographer is on an overpass looking down on the family. So there's a clear separation between the photographer and the subject. And so that translates into um, the the distance between ourselves or the photographer and who they're photographing. And it also conveys a message of a group of people that are meant to be over there, right?
Yeah.
Like they are not meant to really be a part of anything. So the images that I took in the Mississippi Delta, one, I must tell you that the Mississippi Delta is hauntingly beautiful. It's the terrain is swampy. There's cotton fields. There are all these things that are happening, and so the environment renders the truth of the lived experiences in the South. And so, what I do when I enter these kinds of spaces is I do not enter as a photographer first. I enter as a human being first, right? I am deeply curious about their lives, about who they are. The South is, we would venture to say, the birthplace of Black culture in America, right? So this is where the roots by which the Great Migration happened and they went to different places. The South is indicative of the people who chose to stay. Now, was it brave to
Yeah.
leave, brave to stay? That left to be debated. But I was curious and I really wanted to know, how does one create legacy and family and tradition in a place that is suffocating in a lot of way?
Right.
Because I come from that space and I want to connect on a human level. I just don't want to parachute in and take pictures and leave. That's what allows me to get to these stories, because for the most part, African Americans are deeply guarded about these very painful and traumatic stories, understandably so, right? And so I create the space. I'm not pushy. I know that I have something that I want to photograph, but I don't want to take it from you. I rather you give it to me, almost as a gift.
hmm
And so there's a mutual exchange that's happening, and it's collaborative in nature.
How do you think growing up in a community that was made up largely of immigrants or first generation,
Mhm.
how did
Right.
that help to shape you in terms of your sensitivity to people, whether or not you photograph them or not?
Yeah. Well, growing up Haitian and Dominican, specifically the Haitian side, right? I grew up in the 80s where Haitians were being called boat people. They were being stigmatized as folks that are coming over with HIV, that were leeches on the system. There are all of these negative stereotypes that were being placed on Haitians. So there's that, right? And then being Afro Latina and the ideas around Blackness and beauty and aesthetics and all these things were also a conversation that was had. I knew how these narratives personally affected my perception of self. I was lucky in that my family, both on the Haitian and Dominican side, are very proud of being Black, right? So I never really internalized those inferior complexes, but I had friends who did. Like I had friends who were not excited about being called morena, for example, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
that meant they were the darkest one, or that their hair was kinky, and so they had to go to the salon every week to get their hair straightened, right? Like all these things were happening, and I knew that the stories that one places upon themselves, both internalized and also unsolicited, would really shape how they perceive themselves and ultimately shape their reality. So, knowing the power of stories and storytelling, I approach it in that same way. Because unless I bring you the story about the Davenport family in the heart of the Delta, you may not know who this family is. And so I want to ensure that the stories that are told about them are dignified, but also if they ever hear about themselves through my lens, it will celebrate them.
When you went to the art school,
Mhm.
I'm assuming that there weren't as many people of color there.
No, it was only
No.
two.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether that was your first experience of, or tell me how that experience sort of informed how you came to understand how you were seen
Yeah.
as
So,
a woman of color,
yeah.
as a creative and stuff like that. Because I know that when I started exploring the other parts of town, that I realized that how I was being perceived could be markedly different from how I was perceived and interacted with in my own community. What was that like for you, and how do you think that shaped you?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I didn't know that my family was considered working class in comparison to them. I didn't know that, growing up in Little Haiti was considered a bad thing. I didn't know that, for example, the fact that my grandmothers can either only speak Creole or Spanish meant that they were intellectually deficient, right? I didn't know these things. This was normal for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought that it was an issue until I remember being asked by the school secretary because she called home and my grandma picked up the phone and she couldn't communicate with my grandmother. And so she asked, does she speak any other language? And I said, no. And she was like, well, she needs to learn something else. And that
Mm.
wasn't even a thought for me, right? I even remember quite viscerally when I began to become aware of this. I used to take a school bus that dropped me off in Overtown. And Overtown is a predominantly Black area, but it's on the low socioeconomic part of the city. I had friends in Overtown. And it wasn't until I saw like other students' response to me getting on the Overtown bus. I was like, oh my God, like you live there? I didn't know that was bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that really shook me because in my world, I was the standard, I was the norm. And so to enter a space where I am no longer the norm and no longer the norm in a way that is, not viewed in the best light was very, very challenging for me to deal with. So I used to be very happy that, at the end of the day, I get to go home. And I get to go home and I'm around people who look like me, who live like me, who love like me, who speak the way that I do. And I am embraced in that space.
Yeah. The Curious Society is about providing a solution for the changing economic world of photojournalism and documentary photography. They are a group of people that see the challenges faced by countless photographers, and they're making a choice to do something about it by building community and supporting a special kind of visual storytelling. That's what I love about the Curious Society, a member-supported nonprofit that has created an organization devoted to the work of today's best photojournalists and documentary photographers. If you have a passion for telling stories with photographs, you can start being a part of this community by becoming a member or joining in on their weekly hangouts on Clubhouse every Tuesday. Find out more by visiting their website at curioussociety.org. It's especially coming up young. You want to be seen as exceptional, not the exception.
Right, exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me,
Absolutely.
when I started navigating those worlds, it was first off, it was surprising because I got to see the disparity that existed
Right.
in both worlds. But I also became very adept in living in both worlds and every other world sort of in between, which I think I've certainly,
Right.
have used to my advantage, not so much because I had any brand scheme or plan about it, but it was just one of the things that I learned or I assumed that I needed to do.
Yeah.
That was sort of a
No,
requirement of
I
my
know what you
existence,
mean.
and I think that
Yes. Yes.
as a photographer, there's a certain sort of advantage to that, but I
Hmm.
nevertheless think that there has to be a certain degree of sort of self-awareness about that, because I think that
Yeah.
that sort of assumed necessity that we have to sort of, not just code switch, but sort of reshape who we are, can influence
Hmm.
how and why we photograph. And I have to be very sensitive to that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and I'm wondering when
Yes.
you're photographing, a community, whether it's in Haiti or whether it's here in the United States, what do you feel is your responsibility when you are, taking on a project and telling stories that are as genuine and honest as you can possibly make them? What are some of the considerations that you feel like you have to make sure that's the case?
Well, I love how you were talking about the idea of being a chameleon, because
Mm,
that's how I view it. Right, being able to change colors, change ideas, or not ideas, but parts of yourself that fit into the situation without being inauthentic or unauthentic,
right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, without losing the essence of who you are. But knowing that, like for example, I will never go into Haiti speaking English all the time, right? Or I would never go into Santiago in the Dominican Republic or in the Campos not like not speaking some kind of Spanish or not looking to connect in that way, right? So, one, the responsibility that I have is to understand that when a community accepts me into their space, I am a guest in their home. It is not my place to impose my ideas. I may share ideas, we may engage in conversation, but really, I need to become as seamless into the fabric of their society and everyday life as possible. I don't want to create any friction or ruffle any feathers. I want them to feel comfortable enough to integrate me. And I understand that you can't force that,
Right.
right? So there's that. From an academic standpoint, I think it's imperative to read. You have to know what's happening. You have to know how the local people feel about it. You have to understand, in my case, because I predominantly document communities of color, what kind of colonial or imperial or neocolonial ideas are being placed on this country that the people are either rejecting, accepting, fighting against, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the other artists that are doing work in these spaces to contextualize their realities? I think that literature, video, paintings, all these things can influence your practice as a photographer because it can influence your approach and your gaze and what you focus on. And so these are all the things that I think are important when you are documenting a community because you serve as a mouthpiece of sorts. Now, your mouthpiece shouldn't be the loudest voice in the room, right? So really, it should be a situation where you are conveying what people are saying, but you want to convey it in a way that is true for them. Now, for me, I may add my own ideas about it, but still understanding that it is not my story, it is their story to tell, and they have given me the privilege to do so.
You served in the military for a while, and then after that, you
I
eventually
have.
ended up. And I want to get back to that, but eventually you went and lived in Haiti for 8 years.
Yes, I did.
Why and what insight do you think that gave you that influenced the way that you see and you photograph that country?
Yeah, so Haiti is a walking oxymoron in that there can be absolute chaos and then breathtaking beauty existing in the same space simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And so Haiti particularly made me aware that there are always multiple realities happening. And I remember when I moved to Haiti, everyone thought that I was absolutely crazy. They were just like, oh my God, it's dangerous. You can get kidnapped, just all these things. And after a couple of years of living in Haiti, I would still get phone calls. And they're like, oh my God, Vanessa, Haiti's on fire. And I'm like, this block is on fire, okay? Or,
Mm-hmm.
like this radius, but the rest of the country is fine. There's nothing happening. Kids are still going to school. You have the ladies selling their peanuts, or the farmers are out at the farm, whatever. Life is still happening. And so my approach to the work has come from that space. So whenever I'm doing a photo essay, like in July, I was in Haiti after the assassination of the President Jovenel Moïse. And so his funeral was happening in Cap-Haïtien, which is the northern part of the country. And absolutely, there were gangs in the streets. Absolutely, there was shooting, there were protests, tires were burning, all these things happened. And I made sure that I captured that. At the same time, a block away, there were children beautifully dressed in their school uniform walking home after taking the final exam. And there were still children playing in the yard. And there were all these things happening. And so when I'm approaching these kinds of assignments or projects, I ensure to show the gamut because I want for it to be visually nuanced yet comprehensive. And Haiti has done that for me.
So, what did you learn living there from day to day during that period that you think
Oh,
you never would
oh
have
my
picked up
God.
had you just gone in every once in a while?
Yeah. The biggest thing that I've learned living in Haiti is the importance of unplugging, slowing down, and taking time to cultivate your practice, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in America, and there's nothing wrong with this. For some people, it works, but we're so consumed with, like, let's say, technology. What meeting we have to do, who do we have to call, errands, things like that, and it's like this incessant chatter. Haiti literally gave me the opportunity to silence the voices, right, and really think about my work and what do I want the work to say. And there's the professional aspect of it. But as a person, it has forced me to be more intentional about how I live my life. Because Haiti operates in extremes, death is an ever present entity, right? You never know. And I know you never know anywhere, but when there's great political strife or turmoil, it's present. And so you have to really think about, like, what is important? How do you want to spend your time? What do you want your legacy to be? Because death is an ever present entity.
Hmm.
And so Haiti has done that for me.
Has that become even more pronounced after you became a mother?
Yes. Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, absolutely. I'm a mother of a precious little boy, and he's 6 years old. I find myself thinking about, who will Jacob Like, what stories will Jacob hear about his mother? What stories will he have about his mother? I think he's a Ghanaian god named Anansi, and Anansi is the god of storytelling. And so he comes up as a spider, right? And so whenever I'm out in nature and I may see a spider web or different things like that, it's like I feel like nature is like constantly reminding us of how do we partake in this circle of life. And Jacob has made me present and aware in a way that I don't think that in a way that I think only becoming a mother can have done that for me.
Hmm. So I was listening to an interview earlier this week, and then part of the conversation was this: the person who's being interviewed mentioned this sort of understanding that their mother was a woman and a human being before they became their mother.
Yes.
And then there was so much about her that they would never really sort of understand and know about them. And that really that's just that, cut me to the quick, because I'm slowly losing my mother to Alzheimer's. And, so, there's certain things about her story that I'll never have access to. God knows I've tried, but my mother's been very, very stubborn in terms of sharing that. But, in terms of like the stories we leave behind, that's such a powerful thing, especially as we get older. And in your case, when you have children. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so moved by photographers like you, who, even when they tell stories of communities outside of their own, they're doing it in a way that's very personal,
Yeah.
And, whether you're, photographing sort of the demonstrations that have been happening over the last couple of years, or doing the work in the Mississippi, or even just doing portraits, of your son, which I love, by the way. It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
I thought back to some of the work of Gordon Parks, because that color palette that you used in there is very similar to his, especially that shot that he shot of that boy in Kansas putting that little thing on his forehead while he's lying in the grass.
Yes,
I immediately thought of this. Yes, I immediately thought of that picture when I saw those pictures of your son. But that thing of who are our pictures for? As much as they please us in terms of making photographs, who are they for? So when when you're looking at sort of the body of your work, or even a particular project, do you ever think about who it's for?
I always think about who it's for. And first things first, I will say that the body of work that I create is primarily speaking to communities like my own, Black communities, Hispanic communities, communities of color. It's first a very intimate conversation. It's like a love letter where I am sharing both the depth of our pain, but the beauty of our lives. And then for everyone else, it's like I'm giving you a window peek into it. I remember Toni Morrison was talking about her work, and then she alluded to the work of James Baldwin, right? And she said that, or even Ralph Ellison. And she said that, there are certain things in my work that I don't have to explain to someone who looks like me, right? So, for example, the photographs of Jacob bathing outside with a hose in the yard and his locks, like, exactly what that is, right? And you know exactly who I'm talking to. Or the work in the Delta where you see Natomi Davenport, who is half Choctaw Native American, half African American, standing on the front porch for communities that look like mine or communities that I come from. There's grandma and them sitting on the porch, right?
Yeah.
Like, that as soon as you see it, you can think about your abuelita, or you can think about your grandmother, you can think about whoever. And so it's first for you to see you, and then for everyone else after that to get a peek into the very intimate lives of people of color. I don't know if you've noticed this, but in my opinion, we are quite private about the most intimate spaces of our
Oh,
lives,
yeah. I've
right? We
noticed
don't
that.
really talk about
No se
like,
habla de eso. No se
yeah,
habla
like
de
you just
eso.
mentioned, like you mentioned your mom, right? Like
Hmm.
even before she began to have these experiences, like my mother as well, or my grandmothers are not always running to tell me, what life was like for them
Hmm.
growing up or whatever. So when you have moments to explore that more intimate part, it is for everyone whose grandmother or loved one has never given them that space for them to use their imagination and explore that with me through that subject.
Let me go back to your time in the military. What do you think you got from that experience? That's become an invaluable part of your life, but especially as a photographer?
The military has given me grit, great discipline, and like tenacity, right? So in the service, if you take the training seriously, you really begin to understand that it's mind over matter. And so you train your body to submit to the will of your mind. And I think as a photographer, when you're doing this kind of work, it is personal, deep work that, especially when you stay in the field for a long time, because not all the time you will be celebrated for the photographs that you take that you think are absolutely amazing.
Hmm.
Not all the time will they be printed. Not all the time will you get compensated, what you feel like you're worth for the work. And so you have to maintain, I think, that level of grit, tenacity, and discipline in your practice and really understand the mission, right? Like, why are you doing this? What is your why? What is your driving force? Because when you become clear on your why, which is what I've learned in the military, it makes you pursuing this as your lifelong work something that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that's so good. Yeah, understanding your why is what gets you through those moments when you don't want to get out of bed and do it or want to give up.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
give
Absolutely.
give me an example where that kind of thinking helped you push through a difficult situation. It can be photographic or not.
Well, St. Louis and covering civil unrest in St. Louis was tough. St. Louis exists in the shadows of the Ferguson uprising. The racial tension in St. Louis is palpable. Um, and the protests went on for maybe 5 months, and it was almost every day. And it was exhausting, right? And there are days where I just didn't feel like going outside. I was tired of walking on the highway and like all these things. But then I understood why I do this work, right? And primarily it is because I know that history is told from the position of the victor, not the victim. I know that a lot of photographs, a lot of archival work, a lot of documentary photography or street photography will not be seen, especially when it's taken by photographers of color that challenge the dominant story, right? And so I knew that I wanted to create an extensive body of work that would render a set of parallel story to whatever will be told about what happened in 2020, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, or maybe when I am no longer and someone comes across my work, they can really have a critical and hopefully comprehensive understanding.
Our friends at the Charcoal Book Club have just opened up a call for entries for the 6th annual Chico Hot Springs Portfolio Review and Publishing Prize. The Chico Review is a juried photo book retreat that takes place over a week in Chico Hot Springs in Montana. 64 photographers will be selected by a jury and invited to spend the week taking part in portfolio reviews, artist lectures, and panel discussions. And a grand prize winner will be awarded the Charcoal Publishing Prize and have a book published through the Charcoal Book Club. Find out more by visiting chicoreview.com, and remember the deadline is December 26th. And thanks to all of you who continue to support the Candid Frames financially. I know it's been a tough year for everyone, but all your contributions, especially over the past year and a half, have been invaluable to us and the work that we're doing. And if you haven't already, consider becoming a Patreon supporter today. You can do that by contributing $5, $10, $20 or more a month by visiting patreon.com/thecandidframe. Just $5 a month from you makes a big difference. Thank you so much for your support. Do you feel like there are still not sufficient outlets for the work that you and other photographers are creating today, and that it's going to be primarily the passage of time that's going to instill more value in that work?
Well, I think that there are definitely publications. Do I think that the publications always do stories justice? No. But yet and still, I do think that there are organizations, there are people that are in very important places that help share the story in a positive way. But I do think that if you're waiting on a publication to validate the work or validate your stories, then you're going to be waiting for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That goes back a long time.
Yeah.
Even with Gordon, I just watched that documentary film. Was it an HBO, Choice of Weapons? Did you see that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Yeah, it was. I really enjoyed it, though. I think that Gordon is deserving of his own, 5-episode docu-series, but that is a debate for another time. But it was really interesting to see, the legacy that he sort of left behind for so many photographers in terms of, the choice to pick up a camera and to use it as a weapon, as an alternative to picking up a gun or a knife.
Right.
Because I think so much. Let me see if I can intelligently voice this. If you grow up as a person of color in this country, and I'll just speak to this country, there is a certain degree of trauma that you live with, right, that you just sort of accept as sort of par for the course, and you learn to sort of navigate your life around that. And the trauma doesn't necessarily have to factor in violence, though, that certainly is part of it. But also it's the stress of the potential for so many bad things happening, whether it's hunger, whether it's violence, whether it's abuse. And that thing is not something you escape, even if you are financially able to rise above your circumstances. And I think that informs the work of a lot of people, whether they're aware of it or not.
Yeah.
And so I'm, considering that, where you grew up and what you witnessed and what you experienced, how have you processed your own upbringing surrounded by that trauma? And it doesn't necessarily have to be your own, but just the people in the community that you grew up with. How do you think that touched you and informed who you are?
Oh, wow. I want to touch on briefly on the idea of the weapon and then go back to what you were saying. I think that oftentimes people don't understand that the camera within itself is a tool of power, right? Yeah. And that can wield either peace or war, depending on the images that are seen, right? So that within itself is absolutely a weapon. And so when we're thinking about it through that context, communities like mine, people who look like me, who have been visually presented in a certain way, that they show up in the imaginations of certain dominant groups in an uncontrolled manner, right? The uncontrolled imagination of the dominant culture is what creates trauma in communities of color. Because when you are in an uncontrolled imagination of a dominant culture who sees you as subhuman first, that ultimately trickles down into the conditions of the neighborhood, your financial situation. There's an array of things that really impact it, right? So, with that, the manner in which I've processed that trauma is by using the camera as my weapon to combat these ideas. Being raised by Haitian parents, the dominant story for us is 1804, right? Like when Haiti got their liberation. And so I look at the camera as a tool of liberation. If I continue to view people who look like me or communities like mine as disadvantaged, then I will negate to see the beauty in us. And so the way that I process the trauma is to literally turn it on its head, right? So to have a different internal dialogue where everyone has experienced pain, everyone has experienced subjugation, there's nothing new under the sun. So how then do I use, with my little voice and my camera, how then do I begin to challenge things so that Black folk see the triumph in our own stories and operate from that space, right? Because if we don't operate from that space, then that sadness, that trauma will dominate our lives in a quite destructive way, which then leaves our children very vulnerable. And we don't have the time or the luxury to allow that to happen to them.
Yeah, because that's an inheritance you pass on,
Absolutely.
whether you're aware of it or not.
Absolutely. Because like we carry the weight of our parents. And and our parents carry the weight of their right? Mm-hmm. So like it's like a generational thing. So you have to really think about, well, what are you passing down? And nobody's perfect. I'm sure that I will pass down things to my son that I am not proud of. But I hope I also pass down things that solidifies himself or that affirms him to himself.
You were speaking today, you told me, on the subject of bringing creativity or imagination to documentary photography. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Right. Well, for me, I think it's a reimagining. It is a shifting of the gaze. It is the eradication of the white gaze, right? It is centering the person, how they view themselves in the story. And so it comes from a remembrance. It comes from maybe premonitions, but really it's from a shifting, right? So viewing the mundane as something extraordinary. And so that to me is what the imagination is within documentary photography. So for example, I could have, like the photograph you're talking about with Mr. Davenport, mm-hmm. I could have easily photographed Mr. Davenport from the position where I am standing over him, right? Which would have perpetuated the same idea of Mr. Davenport being a Black Mississippi man who lived on the Quito plantation, who has lost 4 digits due to the cotton gin, who was a former sharecropper. Instead, I photographed Mr. Davenport from me being down and him being up. And so that shifts everything, right? So yes, you see the digits are missing, but that is not all that you see, right? Like he has on a Spider-Man shirt. He is looking off at a distance. He looks rather distinguished. His features are so pronounced and so Black and so beautiful that it allows you to see the dignity in this man, not just the physical scars that exist on his body.
Yeah. That demands that the photographer understand the language of photography, not just Absolutely. What makes a good image look good, but that shooting from a particular angle
Yeah.
or under a particular quality of light, renders the
Yes.
subject in the scene in a particular way, and and the interpretation of that image is built on the countless images that have gone before it
Mm.
that
Mm-hmm.
mirror that, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain,
Yeah.
that shot of, pointing down the camera, not only is it just that implied dominance that's implied in shooting from that perspective, but countless images or films where you've seen that and you've come to understand that
Oh,
that's
yeah.
what that means, right? And if you're sort of
Right.
oblivious to that and
Absolutely.
you're just
Yeah.
focused on the aesthetics of the photograph, the consequences of that choice may go over your head, and you may be inadvertently,
Mhm.
reinforcing a stereotype or doing your subject a disservice.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, like, again, being aware of the visual cues that one may not be aware of and how that translates to the masses.
Hmm.
And what story does that perpetuate?
It's always suggested that I think it was Jay Maisel when asked, it says, "How do you become a better photographer?" He said, "Will lead a more interesting life." It has nothing to do with
Yeah.
photography. And I know a big part of your world is a lot of reading. So what's the
Yes.
stuff that you're reading that really you feel like is just as nurturing as a great monograph that you got in the mail?
Oh my God. I am rereading the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu.
Hmm.
And I really, really love that text. I think that it's quite powerful. I am rereading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man because I feel like every time you reread these kinds of texts, it brings something to your awareness that maybe when you read it the first time or the second time, you were in a particular place in your life that it kind of went over your head.
Yeah.
And so, um, Invisible Man, definitely in relation to now looking at my son and thinking about, at what point will society render him invisible, and how do I ensure that he does not erase himself to himself is very important. And then with the Tao Te Ching, with Lao Tzu, is basically talking about, how can I say this? Like the eternal now, right? How you can't really allow yourself to become consumed with the past because it no longer exists. And you can't allow yourself to be bogged down with the future because that doesn't exist. And so what exists is the now. So how do you harmonize yourself to everything that is around you? And that definitely translates into my work. So how do I harmonize myself with environments so that I continue a symbiotic flow within the space?
Mhm.
So that's a rather spiritual text,
But
but
I
it
like
helps
that.
me grounded.
No, because that for me, I think it's sort of all about that.
Oh yeah.
Staying in the present is absolutely essential for me when it comes to my personal and my creative life.
Oh
And
yeah.
if I'm not present, if I'm preoccupied with the past or what's what tomorrow's going to bring, I become a hot mess. And
Same.
and I find that I'm not as willing to tap in to that deep core of myself that
Yeah.
I know is required to do the better work, right?
No, yeah.
Because if I'm struggling with all that other stuff, I'll do quote unquote good work, but that doesn't challenge me,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And that's, and
Mm-hmm.
that's, you can only do that for so long before you get frustrated and all that other
No, yeah,
stuff,
for
but
sure.
right. But
For sure.
it starts with the self work.
Yeah.
At least
Yeah.
I think it has to for me because I have seen people who have produced amazing work and enjoyed an incredibly successful career to the detriment of the rest of their lives, especially their family lives. And I'm not
Yes.
willing to make that choice. So
I
it
concur.
requires me to just be like, okay, I got to take care of my own, SHIT, um,
Yeah.
in order to make sure that happens. So what do you do? What do you do to make sure you're as even keel as you can be?
Yeah. So I'm really big on contemplation, right? So I meditate a lot. And I don't meditate in a way that, some people may do, like they sit in the quiet room and, they may put on some meditation music and or chanting. But I shoot almost every day. And that's my quiet space where
Mm.
I still my mind and I allow myself to lose myself in the present moment. So I do that a lot. I also block out time for my family. So there's just time that's just non-negotiable, which is very early in the morning and later in the evening. I feel like routines are important. And so I set the tone for the day. So, like, I may spend the morning literally playing with my son. And, he's a boy, he's rambunctious. So I'm slamming him down. We're playing around.
Hmm.
And then in the evening, I'll put on either A Love Supreme by John Coltrane, or I'll put on some Sarah Vaughan. And I actually play it on a vinyl, on a record.
Excuse me.
And we'll be hanging out. Yeah, like I
That's
collect
nice.
that. Hanging out.
I
So that's what I
somebody,
do. Like I'm big on
yeah,
family, blacking out time.
yeah. Somebody gave me an album recently to get me started. It's like, man, I ain't got the space. I just get myself in more trouble.
Listen, I'm telling you, it's worth
Oh
it.
no. I'm just like books. You can't see it right now, but I'm gonna have to build another bookshelf because it's just like I keep telling myself, okay, this is the last monograph for a couple of months, and then I see something else. It's like, click, and
Yeah,
purchase
no, you
it.
got to
So
get
I
it.
can't because if I don't get it now, it's just going to be too
Yeah,
expensive later. Well,
exactly. I get it.
well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for listeners to discover and explore. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
So I would say look into the work of C.W. Griffin.
Hmm.
C.W. Griffin actually was in the book Songs of My People by Gordon Parks. He resides here in Miami, Florida. I think CW is maybe in his 60s or 70s. Brilliant, brilliant photographer. His work expands, I think, over 40 years. And so I would say if you have the opportunity to look into the work of C.W. Griffin, it is definitely worth your while.
Well, Vanessa, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I'm glad we made it happen.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks to Vanessa for joining us. Find out more about her and her work by visiting vanessacharlot.com. And remember to check out the Curious Society at curioussociety.org. They are building a wonderful community promoting and supporting exceptional photojournalism and documentary photography. Buy the first issue of their magazine and also become a member. And check out their weekly discussion every Tuesday afternoon on the Clubhouse app. Your thoughts and feelings about this show matter. If you haven't already, please write a review on Apple Podcast or whatever service you use to listen to podcasts. It helps us to stand out among the many thousands of podcasts that are out there. Your voice does make a difference. And remember, you can support this show by contributing to our Patreon effort or make a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal. We also provide a series of ebooks on photography available for purchase on our website. It's my way of sharing my experience and knowledge and another way for you to support the show. And if you can't find every episode of the show on whatever service you listen to podcasts, download the Candid Frame app, available for both Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.